everybody, welcome to Comic Tropes. I'm your host Chris, and today we're going to talk about one of my favorite Japanese comics, Death Note. And every time I come across a trope, I'm going to have some authentic sake. That should be fun. Wait a minute. Where are my show notes? I can't do my show without my show notes! Where are my damn show notes? Give me that, you damn bucket of bolts, and don't you give me the side eye. Alright then. Now, Death Note. Death Note is a 108-volume manga series that ran from 2003 through 2006 by writer Tsugumi Oba and illustrator Takeshi Obata. The series follows a genius high school student named Light Yagami, who is given a supernatural notebook by a death god, or Shinigami, named Ryoga. It allows him to kill anyone whose name and face he knows. He begins using the book to cleanse the world of evil, and he is pursued by the enigmatic L, the greatest detective in the world. It's a psychological thriller at its heart, a game of cat and mouse between L and Light, who are each trying to ascertain the other's identity. But within that are supernatural elements which raise the stakes considerably. Oba and Obata don't have a lot of tropes themselves. They created a very grounded story that features well-rounded characters and plenty of twists and turns to its plot. But we'll read an early chapter to see if they have any, and then also how they utilize the story elements of the psychological thriller to underpin its solid structure. So without further ado, let's jump into Chapter 6 of Death Note, titled Manipulation. The story begins in Light Yagami's bedroom, where he's having a conversation with Ryoga, who is a death god, also known as a Shinigami. In the last chapter, Ryoga told Light that as the owner of the Death Note, he also had the ability to accept a deal to have Shinigami eyes. What that would mean is that he could see things as Ryoga does, meaning he could see somebody's name and their lifespan above their head anytime he saw somebody out on the street or out in the world. But it would cost him half of his life. So Light appears to be thinking about it here, saying, "Ryoga, this deal of yours is out of the question. I'm creating a criminal-free utopia over which I plan to reign like a god for a long time. If your deal would extend my lifetime, I'd think about it. But if it's going to shorten it, there's nothing to think about. You ought to have known that, Ryoga." Yeah. So Light Yagami is your classic anti-hero. He's our protagonist. We follow the story alongside him, but he has very discernible flaws that prevent him from being a true hero. And among those is the fact that he's tremendously cocky. He knows that he's very, very smart and handsome and well off. And you can see a little bit of that here because he's not intimidated by Ryoga at all. Ryoga is supposed to be kind of terrifying looking, although his personality is a lot more playful, mischievous. He's almost a literal devil on Light's shoulder. Ryoga was bored in his Shinigami realm and intentionally dropped the Death Note into our world just to see how humans would react. He's just doing this for fun, essentially. And Light is very, very smart, and he, early on in the story, has to weigh, hey, I have the power to kill. Do I completely ignore that and just continue on with my life, or do I use this power to remake society into what I think would be better? But that godlike power instantly corrupts him. I mean, he's so cocky about just everything, and he's very much willing to kill. It's a line he crosses, and then there's seemingly no end to how far he'll go. He constantly tries to rationalize this to himself, that he's just trying to kill criminals, and then he starts justifying how he can protect himself from getting caught. So it's an interesting starting point, and we have some tropes right off the bat. A lot of issues focus on how the Death Note works. You can't just write whatever you want. You have to know what somebody looks like and know their real name, so that you're very intentionally killing a specific person. Now, there's some room in exactly how you can use that information, but if you don't have one of those two components, it doesn't work. And you'll see later in this story that Light is trying to test its rules. But the Shinigami Eyes deal, that Light just says no thanks to. That's yet another rule, and a lot of these chapters even end with a few extra rules. After the whole manga series was complete, they put out a small encyclopedia with all the rules of the Death Note. It's not too many that it just is confusing, it's just that they would start to get into some minutia to really explain how pieces of it work. Another sort of trope, but not specific to the writer and artist of this story, is that they're playing with the psychological thriller tropes. And a great example of that is, first, you need to ground your story with a very realistic setting that your reader can relate to. So, you know, the office, school, the home, these are places that people know and understand. And then if you introduce some sort of scary element into that, that's where the thriller aspect comes from. So anyway, we follow Light at school and at home. His father is a detective tasked with finding out who is killing people. So yeah, he's always very close to danger. And that's one core element of a psychological thriller. Now's as good a time as any to try out this sake. Rice wine. Oh, it's sweet. It's good. Oh, this is really good sake. Pinky out. I have manners. Ryoga explains that he's simply obligated to tell Light about this offer right at the beginning, whether he wants it or not, so that he can't complain later. And Light gives him a hard time, saying, "Get it out of the way first. In that case, that was a little late, wasn't it? Shouldn't you tell me that kind of stuff as soon as we meet, or write it down in the how to use part of the notebook?" And Ryoga thinks to himself, even though I'm a Shinigami, he's never been afraid of me or tried to kiss my butt. And when it comes to stuff like this, he totally gives me a hard time. Ryoga is funny. Ryoga may be drawn to look terrifying, but his personality is one of childlike curiosity about humanity. He has a sarcastic sense of humor, and he has a tight 15-minute set about how bad airplane food is. After joking back and forth, Light is teasing Ryoga, saying he'd rather have Ryoga's wings, and then he says, "Still, if I kept cutting deals on eyes and wings and stuff, next thing I know I'd be a real Shinigami myself. That would be pretty interesting too." And Ryoga says, "Don't worry, Light. Even without doing that, you're a fine Shinigami." And Light shows his cocky personality here. He goes, "Well, from what you said, I seem to be working a lot harder than most Shinigami these days, so don't lump me in together with you guys." Ryoga tells Light that he'd be a fine death god, and his response is, "No, I'm better than you guys." Light justifies his actions, claiming that he's using the Death Note as a human being for human beings. He basically wants to make the world a better place. And then he suddenly has an inspiration, an idea on how to use the Death Note in a new way. I'm going to interrupt to briefly note that Light is an example of an overall manga trope, and that is Bishonen, which roughly translates to pretty boy. This is very common in manga for a protagonist guy to be portrayed as either androgynous or feminine. You know, he has no facial hair, he's slender, a lot of times he'll have long hair. Light doesn't exactly have long hair, but it's certainly like a big old mop top. And anyway, he's definitely an example of being a pretty boy. As you'll see as the story continues, girls find him irresistible. It's strong, but it's smooth. Light is a very intelligent character, and he notes one of the rules of the Death Note that he might be able to exploit. He thinks to himself, after writing the cause of death, details of the death should be written in the next 6 minutes and 40 seconds. First, I need to test how far I can go with the details of the death, using the stock of criminals I kept for times like this. Light has hacked into his father's police account just so that he has a lineup of criminals that he can test Death Note theories on. This guy kills people more casually than a Texas prison with a death row full of learning disabled adults. Light knows that he's currently being followed around. He's under very light suspicion because he's the son of one of the investigators involved in this case. Light isn't killing these people anonymously. He's really making it known by killing a lot of them in particular ways, and he's calling himself Kira, which is basically a Japanese version of the word killer. And he's sort of inspiring a cult in a sense. He's just trying to wipe out criminals, but this sort of big personality that he's created has also, of course, cast a lot of suspicion. And so there's a special Japanese task force, police task force, to take Kira down. Light's own father is heading up that agency. And all the people involved on the task force are actually being tailed by FBI agents from America. But Light is very smart, and he's noted this. He thinks to himself, if the guy who is following me decides I'm innocent, I won't be investigated again for a while. The second time around, they'll be a lot more thorough. I've got to take advantage of being shadowed now. The next time, it may be too late. We cut to the Tokyo Police headquarters, where Light's father and the whole task force is working on leads. Light's father gets a call, and he finds out that several criminals in prison have died, but not through the usual heart attacks that they had been having. The next several pages are very procedural, with the task force noting the details of how these people died. But we do have a trope example here. I think these police procedural scenes are an especially good example of the realistic art by Obata. And that came into play even more in this team's follow-up manga, which was called Bakuman, and which followed an aspiring manga artist. Very much pulled from their own real-life history. It's a really enjoyable comic if you're into comics. It's sort of a romantic drama, I would say, but it's got a lot of just the lifestyle of being an artist, and I find that really interesting. Anyway, I very much like this art. I call it realistic, especially when you compare it to some of the more horror or sci-fi or even superhero type stories in manga. It's much more subdued and grounded than they are. And I think that that also plays into the psychological thriller tropes. You need to have grounded characters in addition to a grounded setting. They're police officers, they're high school students, they're family members. These are characters that the reader can instantly identify in their own life. The police find out that 3 criminals in prison have died in unique ways. One used his own blood to draw a pentagram. One wrote a sort of poem, and one managed to escape from his cell, but only made it as far as the public restroom before he died outside of his cell. A mysterious man named Watari acts as a liaison between the police and the enigmatic guy known as L, who is really just known as one of the best detectives in the world. We don't get to see a lot of what L looks like at this point in time, but we do see that he's a young man, he's very skinny, he doesn't have much furniture, he doesn't wear shoes, he is a very strange character. In some of the adaptations, like there's been live-action movies, live-action TV show, and anime series, you really get to understand L's quirks, I think, a little bit more because of that motion, and he really likes to perch himself up on furniture. He always sits in strange ways, and he's always eating sugar. So he's a very strange character, full of unique quirks, but it does help set him aside from Light. He's a little more quirky, but they're both equally intelligent, and that's definitely something you need in a psychological thriller. A protagonist and an antagonist who are equally matched, and that's certainly the case in this comic. L tells the police that regarding the latest victims, please tell the media that the cause of death was cardiac arrest and nothing else. There's a possibility that Kira used these victims to test something. We don't want to let him know if he succeeded or not. So right away, L might not know exactly what Light is thinking, but he knows that he's testing something. He's on to him. One thing he doesn't know is that Light has hacked into his father's computer and he instantly has all the results. And he tells Ryuk that it turned out exactly the way he expected. By the way, let's take a quick look. What's Ryuk doing in these pages? He's eating an apple. That's a weird character quirk that they gave to Ryuk. Anytime he can, he's trying to eat apples. He finds them absolutely delicious. It's the thing he loves most in the human world. Boy, that's good. Light explains to Ryuk what he was doing. He was testing whether somebody would draw what he drew in the notebook. He was testing if he would be able to write exactly what he wrote. And he was testing whether he could control their actions, which was the case of getting a guy to escape from his cell but only make it a certain distance. Then Light explains that there were 3 more tests that he did with criminals where the full details did not work. They simply dropped dead from heart attacks. One was to get a criminal in Japan to fall dead half an hour later in front of the Eiffel Tower in France. One was supposed to draw a perfect likeness of L's face on a prison wall. And finally, he was going to have the last criminal write, "I know that L suspects the Japanese police." Light confirms that you can't make people do impossible things. There was no reason for that criminal to suspect anything between L and the police. He doesn't know about them, so he couldn't have written that because it wasn't in his head. There was the guy who was told to draw L's likeness. Well, he's never seen L, so he can't do that. And of course, there was the man who was supposed to die half an hour later, halfway across the world. So essentially, Light has confirmed that he can't make people do impossible things like move halfway around the world in half an hour, or maybe make anti-vaxxers believe that vaccines create herd immunity, which help everybody. So he can make people write stuff, draw stuff, even do unlikely things like escape from his cell, but he can't make them move too far or do too much. Whatever Light is planning on how to get people to drop suspicion of him, he says to Ryuk that those first 6 were just practice, and now it's time for the real test. He writes something down in the death note that we're not privy to yet, and he says, "I'll get the results of this test in the morning paper. L and the cops won't be able to tie this one to Kira, and L will never guess what I'm really after here. I'm sure of that. Mr. Super Sleuth will be too busy trying to figure out the meanings of the picture and note left by those other victims. They don't have any meaning, of course." But Light constantly underestimates L's own intelligence, and L assumes that there's a possibility that Kira killed those criminals as a test, but there's also a possibility that the deaths weren't a test, in which case they had another purpose. So he keeps poring over the message that one guy was forced to write. And he realizes that there's a secret code. If he looks at the first word all the way down the left-hand column, it says, "L, do you know?" Light has a secret encoded message just for L. Spoiler, it tells you, always drink your Ovaltine. Nah, I'm just kidding. You'd have to read the comic to find out what he really says. Light begins his very ordinary morning, picks up the newspaper, heads back to his bedroom, and talks to Ryuk. The newspaper headline confirms, "A convenience store robber was stabbed to death by an employee." When Light began using the death note, he'd write somebody's name in it and they'd simply die of a heart attack. But he's now been able to confirm that he can control how somebody dies, and he can even control their actions to an extent. He sent that criminal in to rob a store only to be killed by the store owner. And when you think about it, that's actually pretty dark, because that means that out there somewhere, there's a guy who worked at that convenience store that now has to live with the knowledge that he killed somebody. Now, it wasn't an innocent somebody, but that's still something that Light is, has no problem putting on somebody else's conscience. He's willing to do just about anything to throw the police off his own trail and to continue his agenda to supposedly cleanse the world of criminals. And that's, I think, where we start to get to something scary, which is, of course, another element that you need in a psychological thriller. You need somebody to be able to do something that really upsets the social balance. And he's able to kill indiscriminately. Seemingly, there's no limit to his power. It's definitely a scary idea. And I think that that's just part of what makes Death Note so exciting. That and the twists and turns, which take place with Light or L, each getting one step closer to figuring out the other's identity. They're constantly playing this long game and getting each other to make mistakes and supposedly maybe reveal themselves. We don't know yet. Light has completed his test, and now he's ready for the main event. I'll use this guy I saw on the news last night. Drug addict who tried to rob a bank and failed, shot a teller and 2 customers as he escaped. He's perfect. And from there, Light is calling a girl first thing in the morning for a date later that day. Ryuk is like, "What are you doing?" And Light explains, "This might surprise you, but I'm pretty popular with the ladies, Ryuk." Well, that's everything I have in my notes. So, I've got just a tiny bit of sake left. I need to go out and get more. But here's my final thoughts on Death Note. Light is extremely arrogant. Is he likable? Yes, I would argue that Light is still a likable character. He's killing people, but we can totally understand his motivation, especially because he's relatively young. He's really, really smart, he's affluent, he's handsome. He thinks he's going to make the world a better place. And that conviction of an idea to make the world a better place is, to a degree, likable. And he's a little bit funny. The fact that he's so smart and he can constantly outwit L and his father and the whole police, it's exciting. It's very exciting. He's always so close to getting caught. But on the other hand, he's always so close to winning. So I like Death Note quite a bit. One of my favorite adaptations is actually the 2 live-action movies that Japan made adapting this. They sort of really only adapted about half of the comic. They really shortened it. They condensed it because it's long. 108 volumes, and I think they made that for a specific reason. Like, I want to say that the creators were tying that idea into, like, maybe there's 108 levels in Buddhism, something along those lines. They wanted it to be a specific length. I think that hurt them very slightly when you get about halfway to 2/3 through the comic. It slows down a little bit, but then it ramps right back up for an amazing finale. So the comic is great, and I love the live-action Japanese movies. They made that in 2 parts. That came out around 2006. I loved it. And now we've got an American adaptation coming to Netflix this week. That's why I decided to do this now. I don't consider this necessarily a case of whitewashing. This is simply adapting the material in a completely new context, because we've got these Japanese versions. We've got the comic, they've got a TV show, an anime, movies. They made something like 4 or 5 movies at this point. So I'm ready to see it in something new, at least to me. They've set it in Seattle with locals. Cool. I want to see that adaptation. It might not be great, but I would love to see a new take on this material. The core idea is so interesting. I love it a lot, but you know what? I just need more sake. So, I'm going to go do an errand, and until next week, keep reading comics. All right, move it, you dumb robot.